You're probably here because you're tired of the hair in your drawings looking like a tangled mess. Drawing hair seems complex. There's a lot of twists and a lot of turns and a lot of overlapping and a lot of strands, to be frank. Today I want to show you a simple, stress-free process to make drawing hair faster and easier. By the end of this video, you'll be adding hair to your portraits with confidence. The method I'll be using is one of 6 that I teach in my portrait drawing bootcamp. Link for that is down below. For now, let's get into hair. If you don't know who I am, my name is Sylessae, and I have been making fantasy art for nearly 10 years. These steps are built from my own self-taught journey. They're simple, effective, anyone can do them, no special talent required. Alrighty, before we begin, I want all of you to grab some good reference material. It helps to have reference on hand, especially when you're learning something new, so I want you to study it before you even pick up your pencil. Look at the flow, look for big shapes, look at how the hair is structured. Understanding what you're looking at is half the battle of drawing. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It's simply a question of, what do you see? If you're having trouble finding reference material, I get it. Google is kind of full of AI, inaccurate representations of things. So if you're looking for photographs to work from, I highly recommend checking out unsplash.com. I will provide a link for that in the description, but it's an awesome site. I use it for all my reference material. There's tons of royalty-free images that you can use in your drawings. As you can see here, I'm just taking my reference material from Unsplash and I'm pulling it right onto my canvas. I like to do this for study sessions because it allows me to analyze a little bit more than just visually looking at something. When I'm analyzing, sometimes it helps to draw on the references, to break things down on the references. You'll see what that approach looks like in just a minute once we get to that. If you're just learning how to draw, hair probably isn't the only thing you're trying to study. If drawing faces also feels overwhelming, skip the face entirely for now by using a provided base or tracing your reference material. Because we're focusing on hair today, we're not going to spend time getting those facial features drawn out. If you know you need to practice drawing portraits, you might want to spend another session doing just that. Today, save your mental energy to be able to focus entirely on learning to break down the hair. This is what's known as a study drill, where you only focus on one element that you're trying to improve at a time. This is going to reduce overwhelm and frustration, and it's going to allow you to quickly improve one element of your work. There's a time to flex your portrait skills, but when you're short on time and focused on learning, tracing a base can really be a game changer. Despite what you've likely heard, tracing as an education tool isn't cheating. I want to also stress that making time to draw things without tracing your reference material is also important. Tracing can help us break down structure, like we're going to do today in this video, but it can also be a limiting factor if you're always relying on trace material to draw your subjects. For the sake of this drill, we're tracing reference material to set up a foundation to prepare us for the study of this particular subject. Alrighty, so we're gonna get into the breakdown now. So what we do in the breakdown is, after having a look at our reference, we want to get an idea of where the sections of the hair are in relationship to each other. So I like to break this into 3 main parts. The front, think of like the bangs or the sections framing the face. These are hairs that are in front of everything else. You can see here that I'm marking this section in pink, and I'll do that with every single one of the references here. Then we have the middle section. So think of the bulk of the hair, usually on the sides of the head. It's usually behind the front section, but sometimes some pieces can come forward and overlap or intertwine. I'm going to be marking this in blue. We haven't gotten to it yet in the video, but I'm going to be marking this in blue on our reference. And then we have the back section. So this is the underlying layer, or the back of the hair, what we see on the back of the head, what we see behind the neck or wrapping around the neck. I'm going to be marking this in green. This is usually the section that is furthest away from the front section and is usually behind the front or the middle section. What I'm doing here is I'm mapping out these big shapes. I want these to become a frame for the hair. kind of like the foundation of a building, right? It's the very simple structure that will eventually make up the more complex structure. So you're gonna see me go through all the references here. I'm marking out all these front sections in pink. I'm thinking about how these sections are also flowing. You know, most of these pieces of hair aren't just straight or limp pieces. They tend to interact with the form of the head or the form of the rest of the hair. And this is something that's important to keep in mind. I think one of the things that makes hair feel a little flat or a little lifeless is the fact that we don't think about the strands interacting with the form of the rest of the hair or the character themselves. Okay, so I'm just naming my layers here. At some point I mess up my layers. Classic digital artist move, but hopefully it's clear enough. Just wrapping up that front section, and I'm realizing here that I want to add another section to that front. But now I'm moving into the middle section. And as you can see, this is, like I mentioned before, it's sitting behind that pink front section. And I'm just getting the general shape. Think the contours here, the contours of these big shapes. And don't get perfect or precious with them. This is really just my method of identifying these shapes and these forms. This helps to simplify things when the flow of the hair gets a little bit more complicated later on. And while you see me drawing on the reference now, this is just meant to analyze what I see, or to help analyze what I see. I know in the beginning I mentioned take some time to gather reference, look at your reference. I like to use this as a supplement to looking at my reference. When I draw on the reference, I feel like it just sticks in my brain a little bit better. It helps me see things as they are. It helps me break them down, simplify them. I really enjoy this approach in the breakdown method because it also helps me see where I end up making mistakes in my drawings later on, which can be really helpful to check yourself with some feedback. All right, so now I'm adding this back section in green. Again, this is the section that sits behind everything else. If we think about the hair as, you know, layers in our digital art program, the pink section would be the layer on top. The blue section would be the layer underneath that top section, and then the green layer would be the layer that is underneath everything else. And I purposely grabbed some that were a little tricky. This girl here who's lying on her back with the hair splayed out, this is a particular angle of the hair or pose with the hair that I think a lot of people would shy away from because of its complexity. When you're studying, I think it's really important to grab the more complex material to be able to study things that scare you, study things that are a little difficult or that you're worried you might not get just right. This is going to be one of the things that helps you really grow and really push past your current level. Don't be afraid to try things. Don't be afraid to try poses and hairstyles and things that are a little bit complex. With this method in particular, it's going to be much easier to break things down and piece them back together. Once we've identified all these different points, what I'm doing here is I'm turning off the reference. I want to get an idea of what the silhouette of the hair looks like. So we have our different parts, but the general shape is also important to me when I am placing the hair in the head. So look for the silhouette, see how you can simplify that even further into one big shape, because later on we're going to be using this silhouette to place it on our base. Before we can place the hair, we have to map out where the hairline is. For a lot of these, the hairline is pretty clear, and I'm using the reference itself to get an idea of where I want to place the hairline on my base. If you struggle with the hairline, this, it's not something that we see a lot, especially with long hair. The hairline tends to be pretty obscured. So I would recommend either drawing from references with very short hair or very little hair, or try practicing with reference material that has the figure's hair also pulled back. I'm being pretty rough here. It's just a general idea. I would say that the hairline is part of learning how to draw the hair. So this might be something that you want to take some extra time on. As you can see, I'm looking at my reference material and I'm marking with a red circle where I imagine the hairline is beginning, and then I'm marking in red where I imagine the hairline being on the base. So I'm using some information from my base here to be able to decide where to place the hairline. I'm marking the distance from the top of the brow, which is where I marked that top triangle on my base, or I guess the upside down triangle on my base. And I'm measuring the distance between what I see on the reference versus what I see where the hairline begins on the reference as well. And then I'm comparing that to my base. So I've marked that area purposely because I wanted to use it as a way to tell where to place my hairline. And so we're going to just go through and mark all of those with the hairline. You can see I'm using that method with each of the figures here, just measuring that distance from the brow to the top of the forehead to where the hairline begins. So now it's time to get into drawing the hair. And if you can recall a few steps back, we focused on the silhouette and what that looked like, what that big shape looked like. That is what we're going to focus on drawing in right now. So I want you to think about the contour of the hair, the general shape of the hair, how does it flow around the head of the figure, and just get that large general shape in place. This makes it easier when we start to add details down the line. It kind of creates a frame for the rest of the hair to exist. I'm not worried so much here about perfect structure or perfect lines. You can see I'm not even using a fancy brush. I'm just using the hard round brush with the opacity turned off and shape dynamics turned on. So I've got a little bit of a taper to the end of my brush. So nothing super fancy. I just want to get the shapes down and get everything in place so that later on I can start to focus on details. Don't get too detailed at this point, and don't fuss over perfecting things either. This is just about building structure again so that you can fill in the details within this foundation later on. At this stage, I want you to keep in mind that there is a distinct change in the flow of the hair. So as the hair flips up and over the head, you can see that the flow of the hair kind of curves up, whereas on the side of the head, the hair is falling naturally with gravity and it's flowing downwards. So keeping in mind the flow of the hair as you are drawing around the head is really important. Don't just draw the hair kind of in front of or on top of or just kind of in a straight line on the head. The head is a sphere and the hair is going to flow around that sphere and create what we see as the silhouette. So I want you to be thinking about that as you're adding your silhouettes. Now that we have the silhouettes in place, we're going to revisit our reference material. And those big 3 sections that we marked out in the beginning, we are going to mark some more sections within those shapes now. So at this stage, it's really important to be looking for areas of contrast. Like I mentioned before, paying attention to the flow of the hair. And we're just going to build within these big shapes some spaces where we may want to add more detail, or we might want to define some of these sections of hair. So I'm marking these areas in a gold color right now. And I'm looking for, I know our reference is, the opacity is kind of turned down a little bit, so this might be harder to see, but I'm looking for areas of contrast and areas of negative space. And you can see that in some of these sections, I'm not necessarily drawing hair strands, but rather shapes that represent these areas of negative space so that I can then define my hair strands to make sure that we keep in mind these areas. Normally these areas, for me, feels like they help define where my hair strands are going to flow around. So this just makes the most sense to me to kind of mark them as a shape versus just using a line. When it comes to painting, this also helps me identify where I might paint a shadow or contrasting shape. So I tend to draw in the same way that I think about painting. That's why a lot of this isn't built with just lines, but rather using these variations of shapes and lines. So this might take a little bit longer than mapping out the 3 main sections. That's okay. Take your time with this. Really spend some time looking at your reference. That's the whole point of all of this. The breakdown method really requires you to see shapes and forms and the structure. And you don't necessarily have to develop that structure in any particular way. It's just mapping it out and identifying it for you so that when it comes time to draw it, you have a strong idea of how to represent it. With that being said, this study method isn't something that you'll use necessarily for completed drawings, but the more that you practice analyzing your references in this way, the more that you'll be able to work from reference without having to do you know, this long breakdown, or without having to copy a reference directly in order to get the idea across. This is going to help you understand how to draw things or how you see things to be able to add to your visual library to be able to draw the things that you want to draw. So know that this is a study resource, and it can absolutely be used to break down more complex things in your illustrations, but for the most part, this is a study resource and it's meant to be replicated. So do this again with things that you find particularly challenging to draw or that you have a hard time actually breaking down to draw. I liked to use hair as an example because I think a lot of people look at hair and they just see this tangled mess of spaghetti and then they go, how the heck do I draw that? There's so many pieces to this, I don't even know where to start. So start with those big shapes, and then what we're doing now is identifying the next big shapes within those shapes. So as you can see here, the flow of the hair on this particular model it's very complex. It changes direction, it changes shape, it follows perspective even. So I think it's very important at this stage to pay attention to how the direction of the hair is flowing. I know I've mentioned this multiple times, but it's something I want you to be looking out for, because the direction of the hair changing can completely change the style. And it's important to capture these areas where some of these front sections are overlapping the back sections, and so on and so forth. So if you see overlapping pieces and you see a change in the direction of the flow of the hair, this is something that's very important to keep in mind when you're trying to represent that in your drawing. And this is why we spend so much time looking at the hair, because by looking, we're able to notice when these changes happen, which we can then better represent in our drawing. Now in this section, with her hair flipping over the side of her head here, we can see that the hair kind of sticks up from the hairline and then it curves around, kind of like a rounded shape around her head. And we can see how the hair that flips around, it flows more vertically as it moves away from the head. Whereas at the top of the head, it's more of like a gentle C curve to describe that shape. So this is another instance of sections that are overlapping and how the hair flows differently on that section that's underneath. Definitely something to keep in mind. Here I'm marking out more negative space. With hairstyles like this, I like to think about there being some gapping in the hair where these larger sections are overlapping. And so that is what those little shapes are that I'm drawing in. Again, I'm thinking about painting when I'm analyzing and when I'm drawing. So that's, again, why I'm using shapes and not just line. And I encourage you, when you are analyzing these things, keep your mind very active. I want you to be asking yourself questions about why you're placing some of these shapes. What is it that's overlapping? What is it that's casting the shadow in these negative spaces? You know, what do you see? When you're watching me do this, it looks like I'm just drawing over what I see, but in my mind, I'm thinking about these shapes and I'm thinking about the way that they are moving and overlapping and interacting with everything around them. So I encourage you to keep your brain active, really think about what you're doing here. Tracing can very quickly become this mindless thing. And when it becomes mindless, I think that's when it becomes hard to remember and really difficult to pick up anything that we're looking at in the reference. So even though we are drawing on the reference and we're doing more than just looking at it, it's still very easy for the mind to go on autopilot and just kind of draw on top of what it sees. And I'm mentioning here the areas of overlap, like I mentioned before. Again, the flow of the hair is what we're looking for. What is overlapping? How is the hair flowing? And keep those sections in mind, the front, middle, and back sections. Keep those in mind as you are looking for these details. Okay, at this stage, funny enough, my recording corrupted and didn't save. So I'm just gonna go ahead and draw it again. You can see here, this was my first attempt. The recording of it is gone, so we're gonna start over. I wanna use this as a moment to say things like this are gonna happen in drawing, especially if you're working digitally. Occasionally, files will corrupt, files won't save, things won't work. That's life. But instead of getting very frustrated, and don't get me wrong, I was a little frustrated, but instead of getting frustrated when the first attempt doesn't work out, or it gets corrupted, or something happens, remember that every time you draw it, your attempt is just gonna get a little bit better each time. So I tell myself that when, you know, digital anomalies happen or I make mistakes, it's gonna be better the second time. And I think after recording, I can say in hindsight that the second attempt was definitely better. So I'm not mad about it anymore. But with that said, now what I'm doing is I'm just drawing out based on my sections and based on the second breakdown that we did with the gold color, I'm starting to draw the hair itself. Now I'm using these same sorts of shapes to mark out where some of the negative space would be. And this is kind of my starting point for developing the hair. At this stage, I know it's probably easy to feel like, okay, it's time to perfect things. It's time to, you know, it's time to draw the hair, right? But at this stage, I'm still mapping things out. And because this is my stylized approach, I'm not super focused on getting it 100% accurate to the reference. And to be honest, most of the time that I'm drawing hair, I usually just work with the silhouette of a particular style, and then I build my own structure inside of it. So I'm not usually working really hard from reference, but and you can see me kind of leaning away from it a little bit here. But at this stage, I just want to show you how you can use what we mapped out to then develop the hair. And like I said, I don't usually do this very closely to the reference. So over time, this will become something that you pick up just from practicing it. You know, it's going to feel a little bit more natural. I love drawing hair because my style is very stylized. I get to be a little bit more intuitive or free with it. And it's one of the few things I don't worry so much about getting correct in my work. Yes, I struggle with perfectionism too. So yeah, don't worry about getting things perfect here. Main things to pay attention to is those areas of negative space, as well as the flow of the hair and how the different sections are overlapping each other. If you can keep these three things in mind, I think drawing the hair will start to come really natural to you. It's going to feel a little bit easier once you just understand the general breakdown. Now, I'll admit, even on this figure that was lying down, I was a little intimidated. This is a tough hairstyle to draw, but knowing that, I was confident coming in and showing you guys how to do it because I knew that this breakdown method was going to simplify it enough to make it easier to tackle. So this is, I'm just, again, working with these different sections that I've mapped out, and I'm thinking about the change of direction here with the flow of the hair. And I'm also thinking about what is overlapping. And part of my representation of the hair here is, you know, my own interpretation. It's not necessarily 100% accurate, but I think when you have that main structure figured out, this is where you can have a little bit of freedom to stylize your work or not necessarily go hyper realistic with it, because that main structure is going to be the foundation for everything. You know, it's going to be that, like, that touch of realism in something that is very stylized. So again, I haven't changed my brush. I'm still working with no opacity. I just have shape dynamics turned on. So I've got a little bit of taper for my lines, and I'm just marking things in. There's not too much more that I could say about this part of the process. It's just kind of, using the reference, looking for those big shapes, and then being a little bit intuitive with placing my lines. As long as I follow the flow of the hair, I can usually be pretty loose here. All right, so we are at a stage where all of the hair is drawn, and what I'm doing right now is I'm just kind of fussing with my layers, because what I want to do is I want to turn down the opacity on the hair itself, this structural foundation that we have, and then I'm going to come back in and redraw on top of it, clean things up. This is the point in time where you may want to slow down, try to, I don't want to say perfect it because there's no such thing, but spend a bit more time with it. Think about your line weights, think about maybe the kind of brush you want to use. When I'm drawing or when I'm cleaning up my lines, I tend to use I call it my Sketch Boy brush. It's basically just a canvas texture, and it doesn't have any pen pressure or anything. So I'll use that when I'm drawing my portraits. You can see here that I'm switching to it, so that's the hard edge, and this is the canvas texture that I'm moving to. So it's just a little rough. To me, this kind of feels like working with pencil. You can see my opacity is turned off. I adjust this later on, I think, because I want to add some line weights. But for now, I'm just adding some variation. I'm kind of using my initial drawing as like a sketch layer, and I'm perfecting these different sections now. So as I do this, I'm also keeping in mind what my front section is, what my middle section is, and what my back section is. And usually I will add a little bit of line weight in between these areas to show a bit of depth. So the front section tends to have a bit thicker lines, but I also add this line weight based on my particular lighting as well. If you're someone who needs a sketch just to prepare you for painting, this may not be a step that you do. You know, the previous version might be enough for you to paint from, but if you want to present your work as a sketch, this is kind of a cleaner way of showing it. But you don't necessarily need to do this if you just want to jump right into painting. I will say from experience that having cleaner lines before developing a painting always leads to less fixing later on. But if you're not the type of person who wants to spend all this time on the lines because you know that they're just going to disappear when you paint them, I totally get it. This might be a step that you skip. But I will say practicing this has improved my lines a ton. This is something that I make time for, even if I'm very eager to jump into painting, because improving my lines, improving the control of my lines, and also being able to represent figures with line, I think helps my painting as a whole. But as you can see, there's a little bit of an overlap between how I paint and how I draw, where I'm kind of, even when I'm drawing, I'm thinking about how I would paint it. And so that's where a lot of my shapes come from. So I'm just moving through these in the same way. I am using my guides for some of my lines here, but you can see that sometimes I stray away from the line. Sometimes I add a line, sometimes I take one away. Sometimes I add a bit more of a curve, or I straighten things out. This I do a little bit intuitively. If you find that you have a lot of curves or you have a lot of straight lines, the hair might feel a little bit off. So what I want you to do is pay attention to how many curves you add and how many straight areas you add, and try to add a variation of straight edges and curved edges. This is just going to help give some variation and help it feel a little bit more natural. Okay, so at this point I've turned off my construction layers and I'm just left with my drawing as a whole. I've also drawn the contours of the face as well, just so our hair isn't totally floating in space. What I'm doing here is I'm erasing away some of my lines. I want to reduce the contrast here so that I can purposefully bring contrast back to some areas of my line work. So again, if you aren't spending a lot of time developing your line work, this might not be a stage that you want to spend a whole lot of time in, but I want to clean up my lines a little bit so that if for whatever reason, I wanted to display these hair drawings, I want to make it a little bit more visually pleasing. So I'm adding line weight where I know that there would be areas of the hair overlapping, or where I know that there would be shadows cast either by wherever I imagine the light is coming from, or from these areas that overlap themselves. So this process is a little slower. I'm gonna speed this up as I talk so that you can just get an idea. It's a lot of cleanup and drawing and not a whole lot to explain except just adding line weight, cleaning up, adding some variation in that line weight as well. Now, again, this is my stylized approach, and I think it's important to note that if you want a more realistic version, the process would be exactly the same, except I would want you to spend more time looking at your reference material and trying to emulate what you see. My stylized approach is a little bit more of the general shapes and forms with, you know, my own interpretation of how things flow. The hair pieces are more like chunks and sections versus individual strands. And while we don't see much of it in this drawing, when I get into painting hair, I will start to add more variations. So things like stray hairs, I will paint into the silhouette of the hair to kind of create an interesting shape. I will do a follow-up lesson on painting the hair. I think that would be really fun. If you guys want to see that, let me know in the comments, because I want to make sure that that is definitely something you want to see, but I think that would be super fun. So just like a follow-up that includes, you know, how I use this, this sketch base or this drawing base to be able to paint. One thing that can help when drawing hair, and I think a lot of people might get stuck on, is add variation to the way things flow and try not to make strands that look really similar to other strands. So if, let's say you have a curl and all of your curves are the exact same length, the exact same intensity of a curve, that's going to create a pattern that visually is very noticeable. So when it comes to hair, it is sort of chaotic. It isn't really flowing in one particular way, the same way all throughout. So sometimes being a little imperfect here can actually be beneficial. I think when things look too clean and too crisp, especially when drawing the hair, they feel a little uncanny. So if you're a perfectionist, this might be a challenge, because I think hair kind of gives us an excuse to be imperfect or to experiment with new shapes or different shapes. That's not to say that, you know, we shouldn't utilize our reference material, but at the same time, draw what you think looks interesting. And even if it's not 100% exactly what you see in the reference, it's okay to do that too. Part of our jobs as artists is seeing in the world what other people don't see, and then representing that in our work. And I think for me, when drawing hair, I feel very free in that way. I feel very much like I can draw how I see it, or how I think I see it, and add my own twist on top of that. And I encourage you to add your own twist as well. Sometimes with drawing, it's not about getting things exactly like the reference or drawing them 100% true to life. It's more of a representation of how it makes you feel and how, when you see it, your brain represents it. I will be doing more studies like this in my portrait drawing bootcamp that's coming up. I think January 1st is the last chance to enter. That's when the pre-order ends. So if you guys want to enroll in that, you can find links in the description. But we will be going over the breakdown method in my bootcamp, as well as 5 other methods of studying that I'm very excited to introduce. But it's going to be very beginner friendly. It's going to be a lot like this video. If you found this video helpful and you're a beginner, you're definitely going to get a lot out of the bootcamp itself. It can be a self-paced curriculum, but it is meant to be an 8-week project that we all do together. So I'm very much looking forward to doing that. We're gonna have tons of study sessions, live study sessions as well. So if you guys wanna draw with me, you wanna watch me break things down, you wanna watch me talk more about these study methods, that is gonna be your go-to. I'm so excited to do this. I've been teaching for years one-on-one, and this is the first time where I'm doing a more of like a boot camp type feel. And I'm very excited to see how it goes. I'm very excited to draw with all of you. I think that's going to be the best part. There's going to be weeks of drawing portraits, and I mean, that's my jam. That's what I do. I just want to say thank you all so much for watching. I hope this was as beginner-friendly as it could be. I'm really trying to help break things down in a way that anybody can understand how to draw hair. And I hope to do more of these. So if you really like this, let me know in the comments. And of course, if you had a good time doing this video, please like and subscribe. I'd love to have you back for the next one. Thank you guys.